The king sat high upon his carved throne, draped in silks and jewels that gleamed under the sun. His crown was heavy, not only with gold but with arrogance, and his eyes swept over the crowd of villagers as though they were ants gathered at his feet. He raised one hand, the one that bore the golden ring, thick and gleaming with the crest of his line. Rumors had long whispered that this ring was no mere ornament. It was said to hold the strength of the ancestors, the favor of ancient spirits who had blessed his dynasty long ago. Whether it was true or not, the king believed it completely, and it fed his pride until it swelled larger than his kingdom itself. He spoke with a voice that cut through the silence of the gathering, sharp and heavy with command. "Each one of you shall bow before me and kiss the ring," he declared, lifting his hand as though presenting it to the heavens themselves. "For in this ring lies the spirit of our forefathers, the power that shields this land. To refuse is to spit upon our history, to insult the throne, to insult me." His words echoed across the open square where the villagers had been herded like cattle. The soldiers who stood in gleaming armor around him shifted their spears in emphasis, their faces expressionless but their eyes alert, watching for even a twitch of disobedience. The villagers looked at one another, hesitant and fearful. Many were poor farmers, men and women whose hands bore the scars of tilling dry soil and carrying heavy baskets. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, eyes wide as they stared at the glittering ring that seemed to catch and hold the light. None dared to speak. They all knew the cost of disobedience. To deny the king's command was to invite punishment, often swift and brutal. Some whispered of disappearances, men who had spoken too boldly, women who had refused too fiercely, and children who had wandered into silence after their parents fell under the king's anger. Fear lived in the air like smoke from a fire that never went out. One by one the villagers were forced forward. The soldiers barked at them to kneel. A woman, her back bent from years of labor, was the first. She bowed low, trembling as the king thrust his hand toward her face. Her lips brushed the ring, her eyes filled with tears. She backed away, relieved to still be alive, though her spirit felt broken in that moment. Next was a young man with fire in his eyes. His jaw clenched as he knelt. The kiss he gave the ring was quick and sharp, as though he might pierce it with his lips if he could. But even his anger was smothered beneath the weight of spears at his back. The line moved slowly, each villager taking their turn, each one submitting with bowed heads and reluctant kisses. The king smiled to himself, reveling in the display of obedience. He believed the ritual did more than honor his ancestors. It reinforced his power, reminded the people that they were beneath him. To him, the kiss was not a sign of respect but of domination. He wanted to see their dignity lowered, their pride stripped, until only fear remained. Behind the crowd, whispers stirred like the wind. Some asked if the ring truly held power or if it was only a symbol of the king's cruelty. Others muttered that no object, no matter how ancient, could force respect from the heart. Yet no one dared to speak aloud. They lowered their eyes and pressed forward, caught between their hatred and their survival. The soldiers made sure of that, their spears gleaming, their faces set like stone. The king's hand never lowered. His chest swelled as he forced his people, one after another, into submission. He mistook their silence for reverence, their trembling for awe. But beneath the surface of bowed heads and hushed voices, something else stirred. The demand to kiss the ring was not merely a ritual, it was a wound carved into the hearts of those who knelt. And wounds, even when buried, have a way of festering until they can no longer be ignored. Nia stood in the great hall of the palace, the torches burning high on the stone walls, their flames flickering like watchful eyes. The king's throne loomed at the far end, carved from dark wood and studded with gold, his figure draped in silks that shimmered beneath the firelight. Upon his finger glowed the infamous ring, a heavy band of gold etched with symbols said to be drawn from the ancestors. Every villager had been told it was a mark of divine blessing, a jewel that linked the king to spirits of old, but Nia saw it for what it truly was, a weapon of fear. She watched as one after another of her people knelt, trembling, pressing their lips to the ring while the king smirked, satisfied with their submission. Each kiss was not an act of respect, but a surrender of dignity. When her turn came, the air in the hall grew tense. The guards shifted, ready to push her forward if she faltered. The courtiers leaned closer, their jeweled earrings swaying as whispers passed between them. Nia walked forward slowly, her chin raised, her eyes steady. Her bare feet brushed against the cold stone, echoing through the chamber. The king leaned forward, extending his hand as though offering mercy, though the arrogance in his eyes told another story. "Kneel, child," the king commanded, his voice thick with the tone of someone who believed resistance was impossible. "Kiss the ring and show your loyalty." Nia stopped just a step away, staring at the hand he thrust toward her face. The ring gleamed under the firelight, a heavy, gaudy piece that seemed to mock the hunger of her people, who barely had enough to eat while he adorned himself in endless wealth. Her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice rang clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the hall. No. The word was small but powerful, sharp as the crack of a whip. It hung in the air, silencing the room. The courtiers gasped, some clutching at their robes, others glancing fearfully at the king as if waiting for thunder to strike. The guards stiffened, their hands instinctively tightening on their spears. The king's smirk vanished, his face hardening into something colder, darker. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone quiet but laced with fury. "I will not kneel to a man who abuses his people," Nia said, her voice growing louder, her words echoing against the stone walls. "You demand we bow to your ring, but you give us no justice, no mercy. You take from us our food, our freedom, and now you ask for our dignity. I will not give it to you." Her words cut sharper than any blade. The villagers who had already bent their knees lifted their heads, their eyes wide in shock. They had thought refusal was unthinkable, that such defiance was nothing but a death sentence. Yet here stood Nia, a young woman with no weapon in her hands, daring to challenge the throne itself. The king's face turned crimson. He stood slowly, his robes swirling about him like a storm, his jeweled crown catching the firelight as though it burned. "You dare defy me?" he thundered, his voice shaking the air. "You will pay for your insolence." But Nia did not flinch. Even as the guards stepped closer, even as whispers hissed through the court like serpents, she held her ground. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her spirit was unbroken. She knew her words had planted something in the hearts of those who watched, a seed of courage, a reminder that even a single voice could stand against tyranny. The silence that followed was not just shock, but the beginning of something greater. For the first time, the villagers saw their king not as a god upon a throne, but as a man whose power could be questioned. And all of it began with Nia's refusal to bow. The guards moved swiftly, their armored hands gripping Nia's arms as though she were nothing more than a criminal. The clang of metal echoed through the great hall as they dragged her forward, pressing her down until her knees nearly touched the polished stone floor. The king's golden ring gleamed above her, a cruel reminder of his power, catching the light like a sun no one could escape. His lips curved into a mocking smile, confident that even the boldest would eventually bend. His voice, dripping with arrogance, rang out for all to hear, "Refuse me again and you shall die before the sun sets." The words carried like a shadow across the room, chilling the air and silencing the murmurs of the crowd. The villagers who had been gathered to witness the decree trembled. Many lowered their eyes, afraid to even breathe too loudly in the king's presence. They had seen others punished before, some whipped, some banished, and some never seen again. They knew the king's threats were not idle. Death at his command was as casual as a gesture, as simple as lifting a finger. A mother in the crowd clutched her child tighter, whispering prayers under her breath. An old man wiped tears from his weathered face, his heart breaking at the sight of the girl's courage, knowing full well what defiance often cost. The guard's grip tightened around Nia, one drawing a blade and resting its cold edge against her throat. A hush swept across the chamber as the steel glinted dangerously close to her skin. Villagers cried out, begging her to stop. "Nia, please," one woman sobbed, falling to her knees. "Do not throw away your life for pride." Another man shouted, "Think of your family, think of your people. Do not anger him further." Their voices rose like waves of desperation, echoing through the hall, a chorus of fear urging her to surrender. Nia's eyes flicked over the faces of her people. Their fear was raw, their desperation almost tangible, yet beneath it she sensed something else, something fragile but alive. Hope. They had gathered not merely to obey the king's cruel command but to watch if anyone could stand against him. And now she was that someone. She was the spark. Still, her heart pounded with terror. Death was real, and the sword pressed to her skin made it impossible to forget. She felt the guard's strength holding her in place, the cold stone beneath her knees, the heavy silence of those waiting to see her choice. The king leaned closer, his voice softer now, more venomous. "All it takes is a kiss, girl," he hissed, lifting his jeweled hand, the golden ring shimmering before her eyes. "Kiss it and you will live. Resist me again, and your blood will stain this floor." His words hung like poison in the air, and many in the hall wept openly, torn between wanting to save her life and fearing what her defiance might bring upon them all. Nia drew in a breath, her chest rising with the weight of her choice. She could feel the villagers' eyes on her, pleading silently for her to give in. Their fear was a heavy chain, urging her to bend, to surrender, to do what every other person had done. Yet within her, a quiet fire refused to be smothered. Her spirit rebelled against the thought of bowing to tyranny, against surrendering her dignity for survival. Though her body trembled, though her throat pressed dangerously against the blade, she whispered softly but firmly, "I will not." The crowd gasped in unison, a sound like wind rushing through the room. Some covered their mouths in horror, others shook their heads, unable to believe what they had heard. The king's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening with fury. The guards braced themselves, ready to strike at his command. Yet even as death loomed over her, Nia held her gaze steady, her refusal more powerful than any weapon. The hall stood suspended in silence, every heart beating with terror, every soul bound in the tension of what would happen next. The air was heavy with tension as drums echoed through the courtyard, summoning every villager to the square. Mothers clutched their children close, men stood stiffly with lowered heads, and whispers carried like restless winds. Today the defiant girl would be brought before the king. Nia, bound at the wrists, was dragged by 2 armored guards across the dirt, her bare feet scraping the stones. Yet her gaze was steady, refusing to bend under the weight of fear. Around her, villagers dared not meet her eyes, afraid that even a glance of solidarity would mark them for punishment. The king sat high upon his carved wooden throne, draped in gold cloth that shimmered under the sun. Upon his hand gleamed the infamous ring, thick, heavy, studded with a blood-red gem said to hold the power of ancient rulers. The court whispered of its magic, a charm that secured loyalty and punished betrayal. To kiss it, the people believed, was to bind themselves to the king's authority forever. To refuse was unthinkable. Now before the crowd, the king extended his jeweled hand, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Bring her closer," he commanded, his voice echoing across the square. The guards shoved Nia forward until she was forced to her knees. The villagers winced, but none dared move. For a moment, silence clung to the air, broken only by the flutter of birds circling overhead. Then the king leaned forward, stretching his hand toward her face, his ring glinting like a predator's eye. He was smug, basking in his own triumph. This was not just about punishing one girl, it was about reminding every soul present that resistance was futile. The village elders stood near the throne, their aged faces lined with sorrow. They had seen generations bow before power, their voices silenced by fear. Some of them could not even recall the last time someone had dared speak against the king, and now here was Nia, a girl no older than their own daughters, forced to carry the burden of defiance. A few whispered prayers beneath their breath, asking the ancestors to protect her, though they doubted even the spirits could challenge the cruelty of the crown. The crowd leaned in, anticipation mixed with dread. Mothers hid their children's eyes, not wanting them to witness what would happen should Nia refuse. The guards' grips tightened on her shoulders, making escape impossible. Dust rose in swirls around her, catching the light like sparks, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The king's laughter rolled over the people, a hollow, mocking sound. "You see, child?" he sneered, his voice low but carrying across the courtyard. "Your defiance ends here. Kiss the ring and I will grant you mercy. Refuse, and your name will be forgotten with the bones of rebels before you." The villagers trembled. To them, the ceremony of submission was no longer just a ritual, it was a public breaking of spirit. Every set of eyes was fixed on Nia. Some prayed she would kiss the ring and live. Others, though silent, secretly hoped she would not, that she would stand for them all in ways they could not. In that charged moment, the sun blazed down fiercely, as if even the heavens leaned closer to see what choice she would make. Nia's chest rose and fell as she breathed deeply, her mind racing, her spirit unbroken. The king's jeweled hand hovered inches from her lips, smug with certainty that she would cave. But within her, something stirred, not fear, but an unshakable truth that no golden ring, no matter how ancient or cursed, could command her soul. The air thickened, the villagers' hearts pounded, and the ceremony of submission became something far greater than anyone present could have imagined. The air was so still that every villager could hear the faint sound of the king's rings clinking as he raised his hand. The jeweled circle gleamed unnaturally, its golden surface etched with a serpent coiled in endless loops. His smug face tilted upward as he stretched his arm forward, commanding Nia to do what no one had dared refuse before. Bound by the guard's grip, she was forced to bend closer, though her heart hammered not with fear but with a strange clarity. She could feel the tension of the crowd behind her, the gasps, the murmured prayers, the children crying softly into their mother's arms. Everyone waited to see if the proud king's will would finally break her. His grin widened, teeth shining like a predator convinced of its victory, as though her resistance up until this point had only been a game to amuse him. Her lips drew nearer to the ring, the golden serpent etched upon it seeming almost to shimmer in the torchlight. Nia's breath brushed the metal and the crowd collectively inhaled. In that instant, as her mouth touched the cold surface, the impossible happened. The serpent was no longer carved, it moved. Its scales rippled under her lips, its body uncoiling from the golden circle as if awakened from centuries of slumber. The jewel that had gleamed so brightly became an unblinking eye. The king's smile faltered, confusion flashing across his face, but before he could pull back, the serpent struck. With a sound that split the silence like a drumbeat, the creature's fangs sank deep into his flesh. The king cried out, not with the commanding roar of a ruler but with the raw, trembling howl of a man undone. He staggered backward, clutching his hand, the serpent still latched onto him, its body coiling tightly around his wrist. Blood ran freely, dark against the brilliance of his robes, and the villagers gasped in disbelief. Some shrieked, others fell to their knees, covering their faces, not knowing whether they were witnessing a curse or a miracle. Nia, still bound, stood frozen as the guards released her in shock, no longer certain of their orders. The serpent's body writhed, glowing faintly as though infused with the fire of the ancestors. The king flailed, trying to tear it off, but its grip only tightened, its fangs sinking deeper, feeding not just on his blood but on something older, something woven into his spirit. His arrogance, his cruelty, his greed, each seemed to seep away with every drop it drained. His face contorted, first in pain, then in fear, then in a dawning realization that the power he had wielded was never his to command. Whispers spread among the villagers, "The ancestors? The curse has awakened. She has freed the truth." Some wept openly, not for the king but for the justice they thought would never come. Mothers hugged their children, elders raised trembling hands to the sky, and young men and women stared with awe at Nia, who had stood against the order and, through her defiance, unleashed what centuries of obedience had kept hidden. The king fell to his knees, his crown tilting from his head and clattering against the stone floor. His eyes rolled with desperation as he pleaded with his guards to save him, but none dared touch the serpent. They had seen enough to know this was no ordinary creature. It was the living embodiment of judgment, the serpent of legend that punished false kings who wore the gold of ancestors without worthiness. His voice cracked as he begged, first for help, then for mercy, then for forgiveness from the very people he had oppressed. But no sound from the villagers rose in his favor. Only silence, heavy and unyielding, filled the courtyard. At last, with one final tightening coil, the serpent released its fangs and slithered back into the golden band, which shrank and dimmed as though all its luster had been swallowed. The king collapsed, his hand mangled, his body trembling, his authority shattered. The ring no longer gleamed with false majesty, it was dull, lifeless, a simple band of metal. Nia stood tall, unbowed, her eyes fixed on the broken ruler before her. She had not raised a sword, nor wielded fire, yet the truth of her refusal had brought the mightiest man in the land to his knees. And in that silence, the villagers understood, the ring had not chosen the king. It had chosen judgment. And through Nia's defiance, justice had finally bitten. The courtyard echoed with a scream that shattered the air, so raw and filled with terror that it made even the most hardened guards flinch. The king stumbled backward, clutching his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. Where moments ago he had been the embodiment of arrogance, standing tall with his ringed fist raised high, he was now reduced to a trembling shell of himself. The serpent that had sprung to life from the golden band had already vanished, as though it had never been more than an engraving, yet the deep, venomous puncture wounds remained. His skin around the bite turned a sickly purple, spreading like spilled ink up his veins. The mighty ruler, whose voice had once commanded obedience with a single word, now wailed like a child caught in the throes of nightmare. My hand burns," he cried, collapsing to his knees in the dust. The villagers, who had moments earlier bowed their heads in forced submission, now lifted their eyes to witness a sight they had never imagined. Their king not as a godlike figure but as a fragile man laid low. His crown tilted awkwardly, nearly falling from his head as sweat poured down his brow. His mouth frothed as the venom coursed through his blood. "Fetch the healer," one guard shouted, though his voice carried little confidence. Even the soldiers, bound by duty, dared not approach too closely, as though afraid the same curse might leap from the ring onto them. The once proud throne that overlooked the courtyard now seemed far away, unreachable to a man writhing helplessly in the dirt. Nia, still bound by the guard's grip, stood motionless. Her defiance had not wavered, but even she was stunned at the turn of events. She had expected punishment, perhaps even death, but this? She stared at the king who only moments before had demanded her submission, now screaming and sobbing before the people. The villagers began to murmur among themselves. Their fear, once heavy and suffocating, slowly melted into awe and then into something more dangerous, hope. They had lived their entire lives under the shadow of this man's cruelty, told that the ring he wore held the blessing of the ancestors, that his power was unshakable. But what blessing would cause a king to bleed before his people? What power would betray its own master? My lord, endure. We will find a cure, another court official cried, falling to the king's side. But the king slapped him away weakly with his uninjured hand, spittle flying as he shouted, "Do something! The fire, make it stop!" His voice cracked into a pitiful whimper. The venom had spread further, his lips already paling, his arm twitching uncontrollably. A hush fell over the crowd as the king tried to stand but collapsed once more. His body shook, not with the strength of rage but with the weakness of fear. For the first time, the villagers saw him not as a ruler chosen by the gods but as a man, terrified of his own mortality. Somewhere in the crowd a voice whispered, "The ancestors have spoken." The words spread like wind through tall grass, repeated from one villager to the next until it became a chant. "The ancestors have spoken. The ancestors have spoken." Nia's eyes met the villagers. She had not caused the serpent to strike, the ring itself had chosen the moment. But now, whether by fate or by justice, the people saw her refusal as the spark that had brought the truth into the light. The king clawed at the dirt, his pride stripped away. He looked up at Nia, hatred and fear mingling in his eyes. But his voice was weak when he rasped, You did this." Nia did not flinch. "No," she answered firmly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "You did this to yourself." The guards looked at one another, uncertain. Should they obey their suffering king or heed the murmurs of the people? The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time in years, it was slipping from the hands of the throne. And there, in the center of the courtyard, the once mighty king writhed, his anguished cries echoing through the village. A broken man drowning in the venom of his own arrogance. The moment the king staggered backward, clutching his bleeding hand, the air shifted. For years, the villagers had walked beneath the weight of silence, their shoulders hunched under fear of his punishments. Now they watched their ruler twist and groan, his jeweled robes smeared with blood, and something cracked inside them, not in despair but in release. The silence that followed was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of awakening. The guards, who had always stood rigid and proud, glanced at one another with uncertainty. Their swords, which once gleamed as symbols of control, now seemed heavy in their hands. They had drawn strength from the king's presence, but with him writhing in pain, that strength felt hollow. Nia stood tall, though her wrists were still bound. She lifted her chin and looked not at the king but at the people. Her voice was calm, though it carried like thunder across the courtyard. "You see now," she said, "he is not a god. He is a man. His power was never in his blood, but in our fear of him." Her words trembled through the crowd like the first cracks in ice. A woman clutching her child gasped and whispered to her neighbor, "She's right." An elder leaned on his staff and murmured, "We gave him the crown, we gave him the right to rule, but we can take it back." The king, hearing this, tried to lift his voice in command, but his words slurred. The venom coursing through him left his tongue heavy and his face pale. "Guards," he shouted weakly. "Seize them. Crush her spirit." Yet the command, once absolute, now sounded fragile, like a broken reed against the storm. The guards shifted uncomfortably. Some stepped forward as though to obey, but none could bring themselves to act. They saw the fear in the king's eyes, the same fear he had planted in others now blooming within him. One of the younger soldiers lowered his spear and muttered, "I will not fight for a man who cannot stand." His comrade nodded slowly and soon more weapons were lowered. The villagers, who had huddled in dread, began to straighten their backs. For the first time in years they looked their king in the eye without trembling. A boy who had seen his father dragged to prison for speaking out clenched his fists and shouted, "We are not afraid of you anymore." His voice cracked with youth, but it rang louder than the king's fading threats. That single cry sparked a wave. The villagers began to murmur, then chant, their voices rising like a tide, "No more! No more!" Each repetition chipped away at the invisible chains that had bound them. Nia took a step closer to the king, her chains clinking. She did not flinch as his guards stepped aside, unwilling to stop her. She stood before the trembling ruler and said, You ruled by fear, but fear dies the moment it is faced. You have no power left. The king's lips quivered as he tried to curse her, but the venom stole his strength. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his jeweled crown tilting off his head and rolling into the dust. The villagers gasped, for never had they seen their king so diminished. It was then that the oldest elder stepped forward, his voice steady despite his years. "Look at him," the elder said. "He is nothing without our obedience. We gave him the crown and we can choose who wears it next. Fear ruled us, but courage will free us." The people erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the palace walls. The guards, seeing the tide had turned, dropped their weapons entirely and blended into the crowd. No one bowed to the king now. They stood shoulder to shoulder, villagers and soldiers alike, united by a strength greater than fear, unity itself. For Nia the moment was bittersweet. She had defied the king not for glory, but to show her people the truth. And now, as she looked into their eyes, she saw the spark she had longed to see, not submission but dignity. The breaking of fear was not loud like a clash of swords. It was quiet, steady, like dawn breaking after the longest night. And with it came the first true breath of freedom. The moment the king fell writhing in the dust, a stunned silence fell over the village square. Every eye turned to Nia, expecting her to run, to hide, or to tremble in the face of the chaos she had just unleashed. Yet she did none of these things. Instead, she stood still, her body straight, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. The cries of the king echoed behind her, but she did not flinch. In that silence, broken only by his pitiful groans, Nia found her voice rising from deep within her chest like a flame breaking free from long-smothered embers. She did not speak with hesitation. She did not bow her head as they had taught women to do. She lifted her arms toward the people, her voice firm, ringing across the square. "No human can own the spirit of another. No crown, no throne, no ring forged by men can bind what the spirits themselves have made free." Her words cut through the lingering fog of fear like sunlight through storm clouds. The villagers, who had moments before urged her to bow, stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Mothers clasped their children to their chests, but instead of shielding them from terror, they held them with a dawning pride. Old men who had long kept their heads bowed looked at each other, trembling, realizing that their years of submission had not been strength but survival. Young men who had sharpened their spears for the king's wars lowered them now, their hands slack as if the weapons had suddenly grown heavier than stone. The guards, once pillars of unquestionable power, shifted uneasily in their armor. Their loyalty had always been forged in fear of the king's wrath, but now that wrath was reduced to a pitiful figure clutching his bleeding hand in the dust. They glanced at one another, uncertainty gnawing at their discipline. Some took a step back as if the ground beneath the throne had turned to ash. Nia saw their hesitation and pressed forward, her voice carrying higher still. "He ruled you with chains that did not exist, with fear that lived only in your hearts. You gave him power by believing his lies. But look, your king trembles before you now. Look and remember, his power was never his own. It was yours, stolen by deception. Take it back." The words set fire to the crowd. A murmur rose, not of fear but of something long buried: hope, rebellion, hunger for freedom. Women who had been forced to kneel each dawn lifted their heads and stood taller. Farmers, whose backs had bent under endless tribute, clenched their fists, feeling strength return to their weary bodies. Children stared wide-eyed at Nia, their lips parting in awe at the sound of defiance spoken aloud without punishment. It was as though her courage had opened a door inside every heart present. The king's cries grew louder, shrill and desperate. "Seize her," he rasped, but the command rang hollow, his voice cracking, his authority dissolving with every shudder of his poisoned veins. The guards did not move. Their eyes were on Nia now, as though she were the one crowned. The jeweled throne glimmered in the background, but it looked smaller, diminished, irrelevant. What mattered was the figure standing barefoot in the dust, unarmed yet invincible, her spirit blazing with a strength no weapon could match. Nia took a step closer to the villagers, as if to close the distance the throne had always forced between ruler and ruled. "You are not his property," she said. "Your breath, your sweat, your tears, these are yours. The land you till, the children you raise, the songs you sing, these are yours. And if you choose to rise, no chain can hold you down." Her words struck like thunder, and the murmur in the crowd swelled into a roar. For the first time, the sound was not of submission but of voices uniting, voices tasting freedom for the first time. She did not shrink from their gaze, nor did she claim the throne for herself. That was what made her rise greater still. She sought no crown, no title. She asked for nothing but the recognition that each of them carried a crown within, the crown of dignity, of spirit, of unyielding freedom. In that moment she was more than a girl, more than a defier of kings. She was the embodiment of the people's long-silenced courage, the voice of generations who had bowed and bent but never fully broken. And as the people began to shout her name, not in fear but in reverence, the air itself seemed to shift. The square was no longer a stage for the king's cruelty. It had become the birthplace of something new, something unstoppable. Nia stood amidst the rising tide of voices, not as a queen on a throne, but as a living flame that lit every heart around her. The king had fallen, but something greater had risen, the unyielding spirit of a people reborn, led not by chains but by courage. And at the center of it all stood Nia, unafraid, unowned, and unforgettable. The fall of the throne did not happen in a single strike of rebellion but in the slow, unstoppable surge of a people who had lived too long under shadows of fear. As the king writhed on the ground, clutching his hand where the serpent's venom burned, his crown tilted askew and his robes dragged in the dust, the villagers began to murmur among themselves. Their voices were low at first, uncertain, as though centuries of silence still pressed on their tongues. But then, like sparks leaping from dry tinder, the murmurs grew louder, words carrying strength they hadn't known they possessed. They looked at him, the man who had demanded obedience, who had forced them to kneel, who had draped himself in jewels taken from their sweat, and they no longer saw a ruler. They saw only a man broken and afraid. One by one the villagers began to move closer. The king's guard stood rigid, their hands still resting on their weapons, but their eyes darted nervously between their suffering master and the swelling crowd. They had been taught that loyalty to the throne was loyalty to life itself, but now even they hesitated. The fear that had bound them seemed to slip away with every breath Nia drew. She stood firm in the center of it all, her voice ringing like iron when she reminded them that power belongs only where people choose to give it. Those words struck deeper than any weapon could, and the crowd responded not with shouts of rage but with the steady, collective courage of people remembering they had always been many while the throne had always been one. The first act of defiance was small. An old man stepped forward, his back bent with years of toil under forced labor. He reached out and plucked the golden sash from the king's waist, holding it high before throwing it onto the ground. Gasps rippled through the gathering. The guards did not move to stop him. Then a young woman strode up and seized the crown from the king's tangled hair. She held it in her hands, trembling at first, then with a steadiness that drew cheers from the crowd, she cast it down into the dust. The jeweled circlet cracked against the stones, its glittering facade now nothing more than broken metal. Each symbol that once stood for dominance, the crown, the scepter, the silken robes, was stripped away, torn not by violence but by the hands of ordinary villagers who had once trembled in silence. The palace behind them, with its high carved walls, loomed as it always had, a reminder of the king's might. But even those stones seemed to lose their weight in that moment. Where once they had been a fortress of intimidation, now the people saw only walls built from their stolen labor, walls that could not hold against the truth swelling in their chests. Children pointed at the gilded gates and laughed, their voices echoing against the stone. Men and women pressed their palms against the walls, not in reverence but in defiance, daring the stone to resist their touch. Dust crumbled from the cracks as if the palace itself was yielding to the change of spirit. The king, stripped of his ornaments, shrank smaller with every passing breath. No longer did the villagers see a towering figure to fear but a weak man clinging to titles that dissolved like smoke. His eyes, once cold and commanding, now darted wildly, searching for allies where none remained. Even his guards began to step back, loosening their grips on their spears, their loyalty cracking under the weight of the people's rising courage. The throne, empty and abandoned behind him, seemed absurd, a gilded chair that no longer carried meaning, waiting for no one to claim it. The villagers' voices rose into a thunderous chant, not of destruction but of freedom. They were not tearing down a throne to replace it with another, they were tearing down the very idea that one seat could hold dominion over all. The palace walls, which had towered as a monument to fear, now seemed to tremble under the power of their collective truth. In the eyes of every villager burned the same realization: they had never needed the king's permission to stand tall. They had always been their own strength. And so the throne fell, not with fire or blades, but with the simple, unstoppable truth that no symbol, no crown, no wall, could bind the spirit of a free people. The fall was not the end of something, but the beginning of everything they had been denied. The air shifted, lightness rushing in where shadows had lingered for too long. And in that moment, the throne was nothing more than a memory, swept away by the tide of awakening. The circle was drawn not by a single hand but by many, its shape formed in the dust of the village square where the throne had once loomed. For the first time, no man sat above the others, no crown weighed heavy on a single head. The people gathered in a wide circle, elders sitting shoulder to shoulder with mothers, fathers, and youths whose voices had never before been asked for in matters of leadership. At the center there was no throne, no symbol of dominance, only the ashes of the broken seat of power, left to remind them of what they had chosen to reject. The air was filled with a sense of renewal, as though the village itself breathed more freely now that the shadow of one man's tyranny had lifted. Nia stood among them, not as a queen or ruler, but as a daughter of the land, her words carrying the weight of truth rather than authority. She spoke softly at first, reminding the people that power should not rest in the clenched fist of one but in the open hands of many. The villagers listened, their eyes shining with recognition, for they knew her words reflected the very lesson they had lived. No king, no crown, no command could silence the strength of a united people. A woman who once pounded grain beside her neighbor's hearth now offered her wisdom about fairness in trade. A young man who had once trembled at the king's guards suggested that those who carried weapons should serve not with fear but with honor, protecting the weak rather than threatening them. The elders spoke, their voices carrying the memory of seasons long past, when the land had been shared more equally. Their counsel was balanced by the clarity of youth, whose questions challenged the assumptions of age. For the first time, women's voices rang openly in the circle, no longer confined to whispers behind walls but woven into the fabric of decision-making. Each voice became a thread, and together they wove something stronger than any single decree, a tapestry of shared responsibility. The people did not agree on every matter, yet even their disagreements became a strength, for no one voice could silence the others, and every decision required the weight of many hearts. The broken palace, once a fortress of separation, became a gathering place. Its walls, stripped of banners, echoed not with commands but with laughter and debate. The villagers decided that the palace would no longer belong to rulers but to the people. Its rooms were opened as spaces for teaching, for healing, for meeting when the circle in the square grew too crowded. The guards who once wielded spears in the king's name laid them down before the people, swearing instead to defend the council's decisions and the safety of all. No longer feared, they became guardians of trust. Nia often reminded them that the ring's bite had not been meant to crown her but to awaken them. She wore no crown, bore no title, but her presence reminded the people of the night fear had died. Some looked to her as a leader, but she always stepped back into the circle, refusing to stand apart. If one voice rises above all others, she told them, then we return to chains. Her humility ensured that the council remained what it was meant to be, a living circle, ever-changing, ever open. Seasons passed and though challenges arose, droughts, disputes, sickness, the council faced them together. The people learned that leadership was not about command but about listening, about holding one another accountable. Children grew up watching their parents speak in the circle, and so they learned from birth that their voices mattered. Fear, once inherited like a curse, gave way to confidence, passed from one generation to the next. The circle itself became a symbol, etched into the village ground, redrawn whenever the rains washed it away. Thus, the new circle of leadership was not bound by walls or crowns but by trust, memory, and the shared resolve of a people who had once lived beneath tyranny and vowed never to return. And though the throne lay in ruins, its fall had given rise to something greater, a way of living in which no one stood above another, and every soul carried the dignity of belonging. The ring that once pulsed with a poisonous hunger now sat quietly, its venomous fire extinguished by the turning tide of justice. No longer a weapon, no longer a symbol of control, it was nothing more than metal, cold, heavy, and yet saturated with memory. The villagers gathered in the square, still trembling from the night's upheaval, their voices uncertain but growing steadier with every breath of freedom they inhaled. In the center of them all, Nia stood, her figure neither commanding nor dominating, but steady and clear, like a beacon to which every uncertain gaze clung. An elder stepped forward, holding the serpent ring with both hands, as though it still carried the danger of a coiled snake ready to strike. His voice cracked as he spoke, not from weakness but from the weight of history. "This ring has drunk too deeply from our fear," he said, lifting it so that all could see. "It gave one man the belief that he could hold the breath of others in his fist. But tonight it has lost its fangs. What shall we do with it?" His words rippled through the crowd, stirring murmurs. Some called for it to be destroyed, to melt it into nothingness. Others whispered of burying it where no hand could find it again. Yet many looked to Nia, for in her defiance and strength, She had become the living answer to questions they did not yet know how to ask. Nia stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the serpent ring, not with fear but with clarity. She reached out her hand, and the elder placed it upon her palm. The crowd hushed, watching as she studied it closely. Its design was cruelly beautiful, two serpents eating each other's tails, locked in endless hunger, a circle of power feeding only upon itself. She felt the chill of its surface, yet no corruption seeped into her veins, for its spell was broken. Slowly she closed her fingers around it. "This ring will not be destroyed," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Nor will it ever again sit upon a throne or the hand of one who seeks to command others. It shall remain but not as a crown. It shall remain as a story." Her words hung in the night air, heavy yet hopeful. The villagers leaned closer, eager, needing her to explain. Nia lifted the ring for all to see, the firelight glinting off its dark curves. "It will remind us of what power becomes when it is worshipped. It will remind us of what fear creates when it is left unchallenged. And it will remind us of what happens when we forget that no one, no man, no king, no spirit, can own the soul of another." The people stirred, their voices murmuring in agreement, the seed of understanding taking root. Some wept, for the symbol that had once enslaved their nights and commanded their silence now lay harmless in the hands of one who sought no throne. The ring, instead of a weapon, had become a lesson, and Nia, instead of a ruler, a keeper of truth. She tucked the serpent ring into a small pouch tied at her waist, not as treasure but as burden and reminder. Years later, children would sit at her feet by the fire, eyes wide as she showed them the serpent ring. She would trace its curves with her fingers and tell them of the night when the king fell, when fear shattered, when the people found their voices again. And each time she would end with the same words: "This is not a jewel. This is a warning. Let it live in your memory, not in your desire. For power, when chained to greed, will always devour itself. But when shared, it becomes freedom." The villagers nodded as her words settled into their bones. The serpent ring would remain not as a relic of kingship, but as a mirror of truth, carried by the one who had dared to stand against the crown. And so Nia became its keeper, not to wield it, not to rule with it, but to teach, to remind, to guard the story of their deliverance. The ring's venom was gone, but its memory would endure, and through Nia's hands, it would never again be forgotten. The story of Nia spread long after the fall of the tyrant king, carried on the wind like a whisper of fire that could never be extinguished. Elders told it beside flickering fires, mothers wove it into lullabies for their children, and travelers carried it beyond the village, across rivers and deserts, into lands where no one had ever known Nia's face but everyone came to know her name. The heart of the legend always began the same, with the moment she kissed the king's ring. That cursed circle of gold, forged in cruelty and drenched in fear, had been the very symbol of his domination. No one dared to touch it, let alone defy it. But Nia, standing with nothing but her voice and the strength of her conviction, had pressed her lips to it, not as a gesture of submission but as an act of rebellion. It was in that kiss that the spell broke. The serpent carved into the metal had turned, biting the hand of the man who believed himself untouchable. To the people, it was not simply the breaking of a curse. It was the unveiling of a truth that had always been there, that fear thrives only when it is fed, and that power built on deception collapses when courage dares to speak. Children grew up pretending to be Nia, standing tall with invisible rings in their palms, acting out the moment when the crowd gasped and the king stumbled back in disbelief. They laughed, they shouted her name, and they promised one another they would never bow to cruelty, no matter what mask it wore. As generations passed, the details of her story shifted, as all legends do. Some said the serpent leapt from the ring and coiled itself around the king's throat, choking him with the weight of his own lies. Others swore that Nia's kiss was so pure and fearless that it turned the cursed gold to ash. But no matter how the tale was told, the lesson remained unbroken. Courage is stronger than tyranny, and even the smallest act of defiance can unravel an empire. The elders taught the youth that Nia did not defeat the king with a sword, nor with an army, but with the strength of her spirit. They reminded them that true victory does not lie in taking another's crown, but in freeing others from the chains of fear. And in quiet moments, when storms rattled rooftops or droughts cracked the earth, villagers would gather together and say, "Remember Nia. She faced a power greater than herself and yet refused to bend. If she could stand, so can we." Over time, the cursed ring itself became a relic, resting in Nia's care until the end of her days. She never wore it, never used it to command, but kept it as a teaching stone, a circle not of power, but of memory. When young ones asked why she had not cast it into the river or buried it in the earth, Nia would smile and say, because forgetting is the soil in which tyranny grows. We keep this not to worship it, but to remember what happens when we mistake fear for strength. When Nia was gone, her people carved her story into wood and stone, painted her likeness onto clay pots, and etched her defiance into the songs that carried from harvest to harvest. No king rose again in their land without first hearing the warning of her tale. Thus, the legend of Nia's defiance became more than a story, it became a shield, a fire, a compass for every generation that followed. Her kiss on the ring was no longer just a moment in history. It was a timeless reminder that justice does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes, it speaks in the quiet bravery of a single act that awakens the world.